All right, I'm just logging on here for a quick book review. So I recently read this book, Don't Believe Everything You Think by Joseph Nguyen. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but it was pretty good. I usually don't like self help books. Like, I'll listen to self help content, but I don't like the books because I just feel like the writers just repeat themselves over and over and over again, which just gets boring. But the premise of this book is this idea that your thoughts or thinking specifically leads to suffering. And so, what you need to do is distinguish between thoughts and thinking. So, thoughts are things that come from the outside and are usually inspiring and tend to push you forward, whereas thinking comes from inside of you and is usually primed by feelings of fear and panic and so it's not exactly the healthiest thing. And what the book encourages you to do is when you're torn between thoughts and thinking and that kind of thing is to look for truth, and that the truth is actually usually very, very simple. And that's how you know it's the truth. So instead of being torn between right or wrong, you should look at the truth because the truth is simple. Let's see. I took a few pictures of things that I enjoyed, like different quotes and stuff. So how he summarizes this idea of thinking is suffering is he says this quote by Buddha. In life, we can't always control the first arrow. However, the second arrow is our reaction to the first. The second arrow is optional. So, this idea that we can't control some of the bad things that happen to us, but we can control how we feel about them or how we react to them. And that part is more in our control and is kind of optional in a way. And then there's this idea of how our feelings don't come from the external event, but from our own thinking. So our perceptions are actually shaping our suffering in an extreme way. So, for example, if you hate your job and it causes you anxiety and frustration, and you start to see that everyone around you is having a good time except for you, it's actually all your perception and how you feel. So, it's ultimately about how you position that job and the subsequent suffering. And then another takeaway was that essentially two people can be doing the same thing and perceive it so differently. So one can see it as this like beautiful thing, while the other could see it as their own personal hell. And they did this, or they had this exercise that was about taking a minute to think about what you would be without that thought, that like very pervasive, constant negative thought that you have. Let's say, for example, the thought is, I hate my job. Take a moment and think about what you would be or who you would be without that thought. And most people feel like they could ultimately, without that thought, revert back to their natural state, which he says is happy, peaceful, free, and light. And yeah, and he just keeps going back to this idea that if we stop thinking, then our happiness can begin. And he shares these quotes at the beginning of every chapter that are along the lines of like the theme of the chapter. And so there was this one by Jonathan Safran Foer. I think and think and think. I've thought myself out of happiness 1 million times, but never once into it. And it's so true. Whenever I'm having a moment of peace, I'll like wonder what's wrong, but never vice versa. Um, and there's this other one, stop thinking and end your problems. And it's kind of this idea that the problem that you have can ultimately be watered down to a thought or your perception of a certain situation. And he says that thoughts create, but thinking destroys. And so it's important to distinguish between the two. We are ever only one thought away from peace, love, and joy, which come from a state of no thought. This one was about by Dickon Bettinger that I thought was interesting. Um, so he says that ultimately the truth is that you do not have to have thoughts or think to feel positive emotions, that they are the absence of thought. And therefore, it's not what we're thinking about that's causing us suffering, but that we are actually thinking. And then he shares this quote by Christine Evangelo that says, "A crowded mind leaves no space for a peaceful heart." And it's so true, because in moments when I'm so busy, I feel genuinely unhappy. And I've heard this concept before. It's like it's called time affluence. And when you feel like you have time and you're not so pressed for it, you end up getting in that state of creativity and happiness. And I can fully relate to that. And then he says, while you can't entirely stop thinking, what you can do is reduce the time that you spend thinking and ultimately just be aware of it. And that is so important, and you've almost like unlocked a new state of awareness and consciousness towards it, and that's the first step. And then he shared this one quote by James Clear that says, "Anxiety is thought without control, and flow is control without thought." I enjoyed this component a lot, and this idea of flow a lot, because I crave that feeling. And he describes it as there's this concept in Japanese culture called mushin, which is flow, and it's achieved when the mind is free of random thoughts, free of anger, free of fear, and particularly free of ego. It applies during combat and or other facets in life. When mushin is achieved during combat, there's an absence of loose or rambling thoughts. It leaves the practitioner free to act and react without hesitation. He reacts according to all of the study and training that has brought the karateka to this point, relying on not what you think should be your next move, but what you've been trained on, what's instinctive and subconscious reaction directs you to do. So anyway, mushin is kind of like the state of flow. And then he applies it to goals. So he says that goals are there are two types of goals that are created out of inspiration and goals that are created out of desperation. And you have to be able to distinguish between the two, because the idea is like, when you read this book, you're like, wait, so if I don't think, then what about my dreams and my goals and my ambitions? And he says there's essentially two types, and you have to be able to distinguish them, kind of like thinking and thoughts. If your goal is based on desperation, then that task starts to feel very draining, and it's not sustainable, and you won't feel any kind of passion or enjoyment from it. But if it's made from inspiration, then you can reach that state of flow more easily. And yeah, so it's like this idea that we all have this deep desire to create something marvelous in this world, but if it's out of inspiration, then we're more likely to create that thing and enjoy creating it. And then he encouraged us to pause and think about moments in your life where you have created out of that. And I can think of a few projects that I created out of inspiration and a few endeavors that I created out of desperation. And so it's definitely there. But I will say that for me, the desperation kicks in when I can't perform the task well. So sometimes I can't distinguish if the goal was out of desperation or it's because I'm a sore loser and I hate to feel like I can't figure it out. He talks about the concept of unconditional love, but then he mentions this idea of unconditional creation, and the fact that when you create a project out of inspiration, you're more likely to fall into that feeling of unconditional creation, which means you would create this maybe even if there wasn't any financial reward involved, and that's kind of what you should strive for. And he says it's paradoxical, but when we create something without conditions or reasons, we actually immediately feel all of the positive feelings that we want. So that's like that state of unconditional creation is where you want to be. And And then he shares a quote by William Shakespeare about how there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So again, this idea of like perception is king, and ultimately whether or not something is good or bad is based on what we think about it, and something could be good for one person but bad for the other. So instead of looking for right or wrong, and he mentions like political disagreements and things like that, you should instead search for truth, and that should be your compass. And I could definitely apply that to a lot, especially in religion, because I come from a very religious culture, I guess you could say, where religion is very overpowering in a sense. And so I think that idea of like right or wrong is so big, but if I change the framework to what's the truth, then it becomes much more clear, because the true truth is not subjective, in the writer's words. It's the same across the board. And so then he makes his way into intuition, and he says that an important note is society will almost never confirm our intuition until it's mainstream already. And for this reason, if you try to look outside for confirmation on what you know to be true for you, you'll almost always get a backlash and different opinions. So that's why it's important to find the truth rather than right or wrong, and to sharpen that intuition as much as possible. And so that's, he spends quite a lot of time focused on intuition. And he says that you actually always know what you want, and your intuition always knows what you need to do in the present moment, but the only way to access it is by getting into the state of non-thinking. So he ties it back to this idea of non-thinking is the ultimate state. And to get to that state of non-thinking is so magical. So he says that the way we can create the space is through non-thinking, and it's almost where all the magic happens, in the space of nothingness. And he likens it to athletes that need like a resting period where they do nothing, and that makes them come back stronger. He explains that Thomas Edison, whenever he faces a particularly difficult problem, he'll have a long sleep and he'll wake up not like with the solution, but it will help a lot. And Einstein would play the violin whenever he felt stuck. And so there's this encouragement of doing that and taking those breaks. And then he refers to this idea of like making space for divine inspiration or divine downloads whenever you're confronted with a challenge, because that's what will help you come to that conclusion. And there are a few ways to do it. So first, become aware that your thinking is the root cause of negative emotions. Create space by surrendering any manual thinking from the personal mind, and have faith that you'll come to the conclusion. And then become aware of any feelings that arise as you surrender and magnify those feelings of love, peace, and joy. I like the little exercises and how he applies the ideas to day. And then he says, there will come a time when you believe everything is finished, and that will be the beginning. So this idea that if you get to this point, then it's kind of unlocks this like new state, and that will feel like the beginning of life. And yeah, he repeats this idea that the truth is simple, and whenever you start to feel like it's too simple and it can't be there, that's just your mind making you think again. And he shares some tips to stop thinking. So eliminate the things that make you more prone to thinking, or things that cause you to be in a fight or flight mode. So he says that your mind is basically built to survive and not to thrive. And so that's why we keep thinking instead of making way for thoughts. Eliminate as many things and actions in your life that do not inspire you. Create an environment that helps you into a non-thinking state, and create a morning activation ritual to help start your day in a peaceful state. Create a space in your day-to-day to decompress, relax, and return to a state of non-thinking. And yeah, ultimately just even realizing and becoming aware of it is more than enough. And can help you to fall into this state of peace, love, and joy, as he calls it. And suppose the rest of it is more or less repeating those same core thoughts. But it was really good. It was very eye opening, and I definitely feel like I'm a thinker and I fall into that trap a lot. And so it was quite a relief to think about how, like, that framing of thinking is essentially perception, and perception is so subjective and it's not the truth. And so you should seek out the truth instead. It was really good. Highly recommend it. 10 out of 10. Very short read. I think it was like 180-ish pages, like under 200, I think. And the font is like large. And it's a very quick read. The only issue is the repetition, which is very common in self-help books because they kind of hone in on that one idea and just keep like repeating it in many different ways. I also felt like the stories that he uses are a little like too they're I think he's a monk, or at least has some background in that, and so a lot of the stories felt like they were from that world, and so they were very difficult to relate to. And then yeah, so that I felt that could have been improved for sure. But anyway, all in all, really good. There were a few things that were very spiritual, I guess because of his background, but it's okay. Like, still, a lot of it rings true. I had to skip some of the spiritual stuff, but I feel like I got the gist of the book, and I hope that I can apply it in my day to day. Let's see.